Hi, everybody. It's me, Miss Denny, your favorite children's librarian. Welcome to the weekly read. We are going to be reading the next two chapters of the Boxcar Children. So if you've missed we've read the first 6 chapters already. If you've missed those, you can find them right here on the library's YouTube page. There is a playlist for the weekly read. So we're reading the original Boxcar Children, written in 1924 by Gertrude C. Warner. And today we are picking up where we left off with chapter 7, which is called At Home. Here we go. Jess and Henry had a short committee meeting next morning before the others awoke. It was agreed that nobody should be allowed to stray off into the woods alone, not even the dog. And with much mystery, Henry left some orders with all of them as to what they should build for him during the morning. "What for?" asked Benny. "Shan't tell, old fellow," teased Henry. "You just build it and you'll see later." So Henry walked briskly through the woods, feeling sure that the noise in the night had been made by a rabbit. Having no watch, Henry made a slight mistake by appearing at the young doctor's door before 8 o'clock. He was just in time to meet the doctor coming in from a night call. If Henry had not been so eager to begin work, he would have noticed how the young man's dark eyes examined him from head to foot, even to his plastered hair, wet with brook water. It was not the doctor who directed his work, but the doctor's mother, the sweet-faced Mrs. McAllister, whose heart was centered in her son and her vegetable garden. Her heart warmed to the boy when she saw how carefully he thinned out the carrots, which had been sadly neglected. "I have been so busy," she declared, "that I have actually stayed awake nights worrying about these carrots. There, see that?" She pulled out a fairly good-sized carrot as she spoke. It had to come out, for it was much too near its neighbors. In fact, when Henry had thinned out half a row, he had quite a little pile of eatable carrots, each as large as his thumb. When Mrs. McAllister saw Henry deftly press the earth back again around the carrots which remained standing, she left him quietly with a smile. Here was a gardener whom she could trust. Henry worked steadily in the hot sun, completing row after row of carrots, parsnips, and onions. When the mill bells rang at noon, he worked on without noticing that his employer was again watching him. When he did at last notice her, he asked her, smiling, what she wanted done with the things he had pulled up. "Oh, throw them away," she said indifferently. "Toss them over into the orchard, and sometime we'll burn them when they get dry." "Do you mind if I take them myself?" asked Henry hesitatingly. "Oh, no," said Mrs. McAllister cordially. "Have you chickens? That will be fine." Henry was thankful that she went right along without waiting for an answer. But in a way, he did have chickens, he thought. "You must stop working now," she said. "At any time you want to do something, there will be a place for you here." She gave him a dollar bill and left the delighted boy with the piles of precious little vegetables. As long as Henry expected to return so soon, he hastily selected an orderly bunch of the largest carrots and the smallest of the onions. He added a few of the miniature parsnips for a good measure. They looked like doll's vegetables. When Henry walked down the drive with his bouquet, he would have seen a face at the window if he had looked up, but he did not look up. He was too anxious to get to the little old man's shop and order his meat. So it happened that Henry walked in upon his little family at about 2 o'clock with all the materials for a feast. The feast could not be made ready before night, Jess hastened to explain to Benny, who was perfectly satisfied anyway with bread and milk in his pink cup. "Your building is done," Benny informed his brother. "I builded lots of it." "He really did," agreed Violet, leading the way to a sunny open spot a trifle behind the house. The building was a fireplace. With an enormous amount of labor, the children had made quite a hollow at the base of a rock. This was lined completely with flat stones. More flat stones had been set on end to keep out the wind. Top of the stones lay the most wonderful collection of wood that you can imagine, all ready to light. There were chips and bits of crumpled paper, pine cones, and dry twigs. Beside the big rock was a wood pile. The children had apparently been working like beavers all morning. Jess had found a heavy wire in the dump and had fastened it between 2 trees. On the wire, the kettle swung merrily. "Fine, fine," shouted Henry when he saw it. I couldn't have done it so well myself, and he honestly believed it. We have dinner at night here, observed Jess impressively. What did you buy? When the girls saw the tiny vegetables, they began with cries of delight to cut them from their stalks, with Henry's knife and a broken paring knife. They scrubbed them in the wash tub, filled the kettle half full of water from the well, and proceeded in great excitement to cut the raw meat into cubes. When this had been dropped into the kettle, Henry lighted the fire. It burned frantically, as if it were trying to encourage the stew to do its best. Violet laid the tin plate over the top for a cover, and they all stood by to hear the first bubble. Soon the savory stuff in the kettle began to boil in good earnest. Watch sat down gravely near it and gave an approving sniff at intervals. Keep it boiling, advised Henry as he departed again. When I come home tonight, I'll bring some salt, and for mercy's sake, don't get on fire. Violet pointed silently at the big teapot. The little girl had filled it with water, in case of emergency. That's if Benny gets on fire, she explained, or watch. Henry laughed and went on his way happily enough. He wished he might share the delightful task of keeping the fire going and sniffing the stew, but when he found out his afternoon's duties, he changed his mind abruptly. Think you can clean up this garage? Asked Dr. McAllister quizzically when he appeared. Henry flashed a look around the place and met the young man's eyes with a smile. It did need cleaning rather badly. When its owner purred out in his high-powered little car, Henry drew a long breath and began in earnest. He opened all the chests of drawers to begin with. Then he arranged all the tools in the largest deep drawer, and with a long-handled brush and a can of black paint that was nearly dry, he labeled the drawer tools with neat lettering. Another drawer he lettered nails and sorted its contents into a few of the many boxes that were lying around. He folded up the robes he found, and swept off the shelves, and arranged the oil cans in orderly ranks, sorted out innumerable pairs of gloves, and then swept the floor. He washed the cement floor with a hose. While waiting for it to dry, he rinsed his brushes in turpentine. To tell the truth, Henry had found a few things in the rubbish, which he stored in his own pocket. The treasure consisted in this case of a quantity of bent and rusty nails of all sizes and a few screws and nuts. When Dr. McAllister returned at 6 o'clock, he found Henry corking up the turpentine and arranging the brushes on the shelf. My word, he exclaimed, staring at his garage with his mouth open. Then he threw back his head and laughed till his mother came down the walk to see what the matter was. Look at my gloves, Mother, he said, wiping his eyes, all mated up. They never met each other before that I remember. Mrs. McAllister looked the garage over and observed the newly labeled drawers. Her son opened one of them and looked at his 4 hammers. My tack hammer, Mother, he said, your tack hammer, and 2 other hammers. That last one I never expected to see again. If you can use it, you may have it, my boy. Now, it is no exaggeration to say that at that moment, if Henry had been asked what he wanted most of anything in the world, he would have answered without hesitation whatsoever, a hammer. He accepted it gratefully, hardly able to stand still. So anxious was he to put it into use on the hill he called home. Tomorrow's Sunday, said the doctor. Shall I see you on Monday? Oh, yes, replied Henry, who had lost all track of the days. The cherries need picking, said his new friend. We could use any number of cherry pickers if they were as careful as you. He gave him an odd look. Could you? Asked Henry eagerly. I'll surely come down. With that, he bade his friends goodbye and started for home, richer by another $1, 2 donuts the cook had given him, a pocket full of crooked nails, and the rest of the vegetables. When he reached his freight car home, a delicious savor greeted him. Onions, he shouted, running up to the kettle. The cook stood by and took off the cover and put in the salt. It was absolutely the most tantalizing odor that Henry had ever smelled. Years afterwards, Jess tried to duplicate it with the same kettle, vegetables from the same garden, and all stirred with the same spoon, but it didn't equal this flavor and this stew in flavor. A ladle as sure as I live, gasped Henry. Jess had found a tin cup in the dump and fastened on a wooden handle with a bit of wire. And when she ladled out 4 portions on 4 plates of all sizes, some of them tin, and laid a spoon in each, the children felt the world had no greater riches. The tiny onions floated around like pearls, the carrots melted in your mouth, and the shreds of meat were as tender as possible from long boiling. A bit of bread in one hand helped the feast along wonderfully. The little wanderers ate until they could eat no more. "I have time before dark to make Benny's cart," observed Henry, biting a crisp, sweet carrot. "With my wheels?" asked Benny. "Yes, sir, with your wheels," agreed Henry. "Only when it's done, you'll have to cart stones in it." "Sure," said Benny with satisfaction. "Cart stones or anything." "We'll need it making the dam," explained Henry for the benefit of his sisters. "Tomorrow's Sunday, so I shan't work down in the town. Do you think it'll be all right to build the pool on Sunday, Jess?" "I certainly do," replied Jess with emphasis. "We're just building the dam so we could keep clean. I guess if Sunday is your only day off, it'll be all right." Henry's conscience was set at rest as he began with great delight to hammer out his bent nails. He and Benny ran about finding pieces of wood to fasten the wheels on. A visit to the dump was necessary at last in order to find just the right piece of timber for a tongue. But before it was too dark to see, Henry had pounded the last nail in place and trundled the flat cart back and forth just to see it go. The cart seemed valuable enough to all of them to take it into the house for the night. And Henry could not afford to laugh at Benny for going to sleep with his hand upon one of his precious wheels, for he himself had tucked his new hammer under his pillow. And that is the end of chapter 7. Now we'll read chapter 8, which is called Building the Dam. Even a hammer makes a good pillow if one is tired enough, and the freight car family slept until the 9 o'clock church bells began to ring faintly in the valley. There were at least a dozen churches, and their faraway bells sounded sweetly harmonious in so many different keys. "They almost play a tune," said Violet as she listened. "I like music all right," replied Henry in a businesslike way, "but I, for one, shall have to get to work." "This will be a good way to wash all the stockings," said Jess. "We'll all be waiting so much in the brook anyway." After breakfast, the first thing Henry did was to survey with critical eyes the spot they had chosen for a pool. It was a hollow about 3 yards across. There were no stones in it at all. "It's big enough already," remarked Henry at last, "but it hasn't enough water in it." He measured its depth with a stick. "We'll have to guess it at inches," he said. "I have a little tape measure in my work bag," ventured his sister Violet. Henry flashed her a smile. "Is there anything you haven't got in your work bag?" he asked her. The children measured the wet stick carefully. The water was just 10 inches deep in the deepest part. Henry explained his plan of engineering to his sisters. "We'll have to haul some big logs across this narrow part and stuff them from this end with stones and underbrush. It ought to be 3 feet deep before we get through." "Oh, Henry," protested Jess, "Benny will get drowned." "Drowned?" echoed Henry. "How tall do you think he is anyhow?" They measured the little boy and found him to be 42 inches tall. That settled it. The pool was designed to be 3 feet in depth. Luckily, the largest logs were not far away, but as it was a matter of great labor for the builders to drag them to the scene of operations. "Let's get all the logs up here first," suggested Jess. "Then we can have the fun of laying them across." 2 older children dragged all the logs while Benny and Violet attended to the stones with the help of the cart. Occasionally, Henry was called upon to assist with a heavy stone. For the most part, Benny puffed out his cheeks and heaved the stones himself. In fact, Henry decided at this point to let Benny drop them into the water as he gathered them. "Splash them right in, old fellow," he directed. "Only keep them in a nice straight line right across this place between these 2 trees. It won't make any difference how wet he gets," he added as an aside to Jess. "We can dry him in the sun." Jess thought a little differently, although she said nothing. She took off Benny's little crinkled blouse and 1 pair of bloomers and started to hang them on the line. "Good time to wash them," she exclaimed. "Let me wash them," begged Violet. "You're more useful building the dam." There was wisdom in this suggestion, so Jess accepted it gratefully and even added Henry's blouse to the laundry. When we finish the dam, they will surely be dry, she said. As for Henry, he was only too glad to work without it. Makes me feel lighter, he declared. Rare and beautiful birds came and watched the barefooted children as they scurried around building their wall of masonry. But the children did not have any eyes for birds then. They watched with delighted eyes as each stone was added to the wall under the clear water and began to rise almost to the surface. That makes a solid foundation for the logs, you see, exclaimed Henry with pride. They won't be floating off downstream the minute we lay on them. Then at last the time arrived when they were to lay the logs on. Let's wedge the first one between these two trees, said Jess with a happy thought. Then, if each end of the log is on the upper side of the trees, the harder the water pounds, the tighter the dam gets. Good work, exclaimed Henry admiringly. That's just what we'll do. But the children were not at all prepared for what happened the moment the first big log was splashed into its place on top of the stone wall. The water, defeated in its course down the rocky bed, gurgled and chased about as it met the opposing log and found every possible hole to escape. Leaks, said Henry briefly, as the water began to rush around both ends and pour over the top of the log. We'll make the log so thick it can't get through. We'll lay 3 logs across with 3 logs on top of them and 3 more on top of that. The children set about stubbornly to accomplish this. Violet held great sprays of fine underbrush in place until each log was laid. Wetter children never were seen, but nobody cared. They resolutely plugged the ends with more stones, more underbrush, and more logs. Each time a leak was discovered, someone dropped a stone over it. Even Benny caught the fever of conquering the mischievous water, which slipped from their grasp like quicksilver. When the 3 top logs were last dropped into place, the excited children sat down to watch the pool fill. This it did slowly. Finding now no means of exit, the water was quieter. It rose steadily up the barricade of the logs. It widened beautifully. Henry could not sit still. It slopes, he cried. See how clear it is and how still see how still it is? Then the water began to overflow the logs. It spilled over the top with a delightful curve, and on the other side it formed a second waterfall, not high and narrow and graceful like the natural fall above, but very low and wide. Just like a regular mill dam, said Henry. He held the measuring stick out as far as he could and plunged it into the water. It lacked an inch of being 3 feet deep. Deep enough, he declared. In fact, it looked so deep that Benny could not conceal a slight fear. That's the beauty of the slope, observed Jess. Benny can wade in just as far as he wants to and no farther. We all know that what the bed of the pool is like, no holes or stones. Girls had to leave to prepare dinner, but Henry could not be persuaded to leave the wonderful swimming pool. I'd rather swim than eat, he said. Luckily for the children, their supply of provisions was the largest of any day since their flight. The girls lighted the fire and heated up the remainder of the stew and cut the bread. The butter, hard and cold in the refrigerator, was taken out and 4 portions cut from it. The 2 donuts made 4 half rings for dessert. The cooks rang the dinner bell. This was an ingenious arrangement hung on a low branch. It consisted of a bent steel swung on a string. Violet hit it sharply with another piece of steel. It sounded deeply and musically through the woods, and the boys understood it and obeyed at once. It was evident the moment they appeared that at least 3 of the family had been swimming. Watch shook himself violently at intervals, splattering water drops in all directions. Henry and Benny, fresh and radiant, with plastered hair and clean, dry stockings and blouses, apparently liked to swim and eat too. You can actually swim a few strokes in it, Jess, if you're careful, Henry said with excusable pride as he sat down to dinner. Building a dam is a wonderful sauce for dinner. I think stew is much better the second day, observed Benny, eating hungrily. There remained 2 more adventures for the eventful day. The girls cut their hair. Violet's dark curls came off first. They're awfully in the way, explained Violet, and so much trouble when you're working. They were tangled too, and just cut them evenly by a string with Violet's little scissors. Jess's chestnut hair was long and silky and nicely braided. She never murmured as it came off too. The two girls ran to the brook mirror to see how they looked. The new haircut was very becoming to both. "I like you better that way," said Henry approvingly. "Looks more sensible when you're living in the woods." Around 4 o'clock, the children took a long walk in the opposite direction from any of their other explorations. They were rewarded by 2 discoveries. One was a hollow tree literally filled with walnuts, gathered presumably by a thrifty squirrel the previous fall. The other discovery frightened them a little just at first, for with bristling back and a loud bark, Watch suddenly began to root out something in the leaves, and that something began to cackle and half run and half fly from the intruders. It was a runaway hen. The children succeeded in catching the dog and reducing him to order, although it was clear he liked very much to chase hens. "She had some eggs too," remarked Benny, as if trying to make pleasant conversation. Jess bent over incredulously and saw a rude nest in the moss in which there were 5 eggs. "A runaway hen," said Henry, hardly believing his eyes. "She wants to hide her nest and raise chickens." The children had no scruples at all about taking the eggs. "Almost a gift from heaven," said Violet, stroking one of the eggs with a delicate finger. "It wouldn't be polite to refuse them." Scrambled eggs made a delicious supper for the children. Jess broke all the eggs into the biggest bowl and beat them vigorously with a spoon until they were light and foamy. Then she added milk and salt and delegated Violet to beat them some more while she prepared the fire. The big kettle, empty and clean, was hung over the low fire and butter was dropped in. Jess watched it anxiously, tipping the kettle slightly in all directions. When the butter had reached the exact shade of brown, Jess poured in the eggs and stirred them carefully, holding her skirts away from the fire. She was amply repaid for her care when she saw her family attack the meal. Clearly, this was a feast day. "We shall have to be satisfied tomorrow to live on bread and milk," she observed, scraping up the last delicious morsel. But when tomorrow came, they had more than bread and milk, as you will soon see. All right, that is where we will leave off for this edition of the Weekly Read. I hope you join us again next time. We'll pick up with the very next chapter, which is called Cherry Picking. All right, take care. See you then.